The Supreme Court issued a 5-4 emergency order that instantly sent shockwaves across the country. No hearing, no full briefing, no extended argument, just a sudden intervention from the highest court in America that immediately changed the direction of a major national dispute. Legal observers, state officials, and federal agencies all woke up scrambling because this wasn't just any order. This was the kind of ruling that flips the playing field overnight, leaving everyone asking the same question: what happens next? And the truth is, what comes next may reshape constitutional boundaries for years. The emergency order came down in a way that felt almost surgical, precise, abrupt, and powerful. 5 justices agreed that the situation below had spiraled too far, too fast, and that the Supreme Court had no choice but to step in. 4 justices, however, issued an immediate protest, warning that the court was bending its own rules, injecting itself into a fast-moving conflict, and setting a precedent that could impact every state versus federal dispute going forward. But regardless of their frustrations, the majority won, and the moment the order became public, the legal landscape shifted nationwide. What made this moment even more explosive was the fact that this case wasn't just another routine legal disagreement. It involved core questions about state authority, federal power, constitutional responsibility, and whether states can take matters into their own hands when they believe the federal government is failing in its duty. For months, lower courts had been fighting over these issues, issuing temporary orders, blocking each other, and arguing over jurisdiction. And while the battle continued, states were acting on those rulings, implementing policies, enforcing new restrictions, and setting up protective measures they believed were justified. But all of that came crashing down once the Supreme Court stepped in. Overnight, everything states had been relying on was suddenly on hold. The emergency order effectively overrode the lower court injunction, meaning federal agencies regained certain authorities they had lost. States that were celebrating small victories suddenly found themselves stripped of protections they believed were essential. Governors who had spent weeks pushing aggressive legal arguments suddenly had to rethink their strategy from scratch. And the public, already overwhelmed by national tension, was left wondering how something so significant could be changed so quickly with the stroke of a single emergency order. For the majority of the court, the reason was simple. They believed the lower courts had overstepped. The justices argued that emergency conditions required immediate correction and that waiting months for a full appeal could cause more damage. But the 4 dissenters disagreed sharply, arguing that the court's majority was using emergency powers too casually, bypassing the normal process and potentially undermining the stability of the judicial system. They warned that this type of intervention, especially on such a contentious issue, would invite more political pressure, more rapid response decisions, and more legal chaos. But whether you agree with the dissent or not, the reality is that the order is in effect right now, and states have already begun responding. Some governors have vowed to continue their policies regardless of federal pressure, claiming constitutional self-defense. Others have argued that the Supreme Court's order confirms federal supremacy. Meanwhile, the federal government is now moving quickly to reassert the powers it regained through the ruling, directing agencies to resume operations that had been blocked or restricted just days earlier. This sudden shift has led to a flurry of new litigation. Lawyers are filing emergency motions at rapid speed, trying to either reinforce state rights or challenge the federal government's newly restored authority. Some legal experts believe the Supreme Court's order opens the door for a much larger constitutional showdown. Others argue that the court is testing the boundaries of its emergency docket, sometimes called the shadow-docket, which critics say gives the court too much power to shape major policies without full transparency. But one thing is certain: the majority's willingness to act so quickly means this fight is far from over. And while the court insists this is only a temporary order, something designed to pause the situation until fuller arguments can be heard, the impact is already huge. The emergency order resets the legal battlefield. It changes how states behave. It changes how federal agencies operate, and it changes the assumptions legal scholars had about how far the Supreme Court will go in emergency situations. Even more importantly, it hints at how the court might rule in the final full decision. If the majority felt strongly enough to intervene now, it's a sign that their eventual ruling may lean in the same direction. What makes this even more intense is that states involved in the case argue they are acting out of necessity, claiming the federal government has failed in its constitutional obligations. They insist that federal agencies are not providing the protection or enforcement required under federal law, forcing states to step in and defend their own citizens. Those arguments have been gaining traction in some court, with certain judges agreeing that states have a right to take protective action when the federal government fails to do so. But the Supreme Court's emergency order signals that the majority may not view those arguments the same way. This is setting up a massive constitutional collision between state sovereignty and federal supremacy. And depending on where the court lands in its final opinion, the decision could impact far more than this single case. It could determine the limits of how far states can go in asserting self-defense. It could redefine when the federal government has exclusive power. It could reshape how the judiciary handles emergency intervention. It could even change how future presidents wield executive authority. This emergency order doesn't end the conflict. It accelerates it. It forces every involved party to regroup, re-strategize, and prepare for the next phase. States that thought they were winning now have to rebuild their arguments. Federal agencies have to justify the actions they're taking under the restored authority. And the Supreme Court, now fully involved, will have to brace for an onslaught of new filings, emergency motions, and requests for clarification. Behind the scenes, multiple states are currently drafting new legal arguments in anticipation of the next round. In the legal community, analysts are breaking down every word of the court's brief order, trying to read between the lines and predict the outcome of the coming Supreme Court battle. Meanwhile, the public reaction is heating up. Supporters of state authority are accusing the court of siding with the federal government too quick. Supporters of federal authority argue the court prevented states from overreaching. And millions of Americans watching this unfold online are trying to understand why the Supreme Court keeps making major national decisions through emergency order instead of full opinion. This debate will only grow bigger as more emergency cases land at the court. And right now, with this 5-4 split, it's clear that the justices themselves are divided over how far emergency intervention should go. But the truth is, Supreme Court acted because it knows the stakes are enormous. By issuing this emergency order, the court has effectively taken control of the timeline. It is signaling that the lower courts cannot move too far ahead without oversight, especially in cases involving constitutional authority. And now the entire country is waiting for what comes next. Full hearings, the oral argument, and the final decision that could transform national policy. Because what comes next isn't just a ruling, it's a decision that could alter the balance of federal and state power for generations. And for many legal experts, this emergency order wasn't just a reaction to a dispute. It was a preview, a warning, a sign that the Supreme Court is preparing to reshape the boundaries of authority in a way that will be felt in every state across the country. That's why this 5-4 emergency order exploded nationwide. And that's why what's coming next could truly change everything.